She was cast aside, left to suffer alone. But the man who dared to love her uncovered a truth that no one could believe. In the heart of a sun-drenched village called Ekunde, where golden plains stretched endlessly and ancient baobab trees whispered secrets to the wind, there lived a young woman named Nyahira. Her name meant one who brings joy, but life had stolen joy from her long ago. Nyahira wasn't like the other girls in Ekunde. Her eyes, once filled with light and laughter, now stared blankly into nothingness. She wasn't born this way. The world used to be bright and full of colour for her. But after a strange illness swept through the village when she was 6, she woke up to endless darkness. At first, the village pitied her. They brought herbs and prayers, hoping to restore her sight. But when nothing worked, their sympathy turned into fear. Whispers began to spread like wildfire. Some said the gods had cursed her. Others claimed she must have done something terrible in a past life to deserve such punishment. Over time, the people stopped speaking to her altogether. Children were told to stay away from her. The market women pulled their baskets closer when she passed. Even her own family, once filled with love and warmth, began to distance themselves, all except her little brother, Jabari, who still saw her for who she truly was. Nyahira's world became smaller and smaller. Her days were filled with silence and cold shoulders. Her nights with tears she refused to let anyone hear. She wasn't just blind, she was invisible. Each day, she sat beneath the old fig tree on the village's edge, listening to the wind and the distant sounds of laughter that no longer welcomed her. She dreamed of a day when someone would look at her and not see a curse, but see her. Nyahira still believed, deep down, that she was more than her blindness. She just didn't know the world would need to learn that the hard way. Nyahira wasn't always blind. There was a time when she ran through the fields of Ekunde with bare feet, the wind dancing through her hair and her laughter ringing out like a song carried by the breeze. She would chase the butterflies, spin under the sun, and race with the village children until her legs couldn't carry her anymore. Her mother would call her home, smiling, and her father would lift her into his arms, calling her his little ray of light. The village adored her. She was full of life, and it was impossible not to love her. But everything changed when she fell ill. It started with a fever, burning so hot that her mother stayed by her side for days, praying to the gods. The healer tried every remedy he knew, but nothing worked. When the fever finally broke, her parents rejoiced, until they realized something was terribly wrong. Nyahira couldn't see. Her once bright, curious eyes stared into nothingness. She called out for her mother, her voice trembling in fear, but her mother's face was gone from her world forever. At first, the village was sympathetic. People came to visit, bringing fruit and gifts to help her recover. But when her sight never returned, sympathy turned to suspicion. Ekunde was a place built on old beliefs and even older fears. Some began to whisper that the gods must have taken her sight as punishment. For what? No one knew. Others claimed she must have been touched by evil spirits. The kindness she once knew faded. The other children who used to run and play with her now stared from a distance, their mothers pulling them away, warning them not to get too close. The whispers grew louder. They would say she brings misfortune wherever she goes. They would say, her blindness is a sign, she's cursed. By the time Nyahira was 16, the whispers had turned to silence. The people of Ekunde stopped looking at her altogether, as if pretending she didn't exist would make her go away. Her family, once full of warmth and love, began to pull away too. Her father, once proud, now avoided her gaze. Her mother spoke less and less, until one day, she stopped speaking to Nyahira entirely. The only one who stayed by her side was her younger brother, Jabari. He was small but fearless, his name meaning brave one, and he lived up to it. He held her hand when they walked to the river. He stole bread from the market when Nyahira hadn't eaten for days. He even fought other boys who mocked her, coming home with bruises and a black eye, but never regretting it. You're not a curse, he told her. They're just too blind to see you. Still, life was cruel. Forced to live on the edge of the village, Nyahira learned to survive on her own. She gathered scraps left behind after the market closed, drinking from the stream when no one was looking. Some night, hunger gnawed at her so fiercely that she lay awake, her stomach twisting in pain. Other nights, loneliness hurt worse than any hunger ever could. She would listen to the village fires crackling in the distance, the sound of laughter and singing that no longer welcomed her. But even in the darkest moments, Nyahira refused to cry. She sat beneath the old fig tree near her hut, her head held high. Though she couldn't see the stars above her, she wasn't sure if it was stubbornness or hope that kept her going, maybe both. Deep in her heart, she still believed that one day, someone would see her for who she really was. Not a curse, not a burden, just Nyahira. Nyahira's days were filled with pain, but not the kind that comes from hunger or exhaustion. It was the pain of being treated like she wasn't even human. The people of Ekunde no longer spoke to her, but their silence wasn't the worst part. It was their actions that cut the deepest. Children followed her at a distance, giggling and mimicking her clumsy steps, stumbling and pretending to be blind like her. They laughed when she tripped over rocks or walked into walls, their cruel voices echoing in her ears. The mothers didn't stop them. They only watched with cold eyes, some even pulling their children away as if Nyahira's blindness might spread like a sickness. The market women were even harsher. Nyahira would wander near the food stalls, hoping someone might take pity on her, but they never did. When she reached out, guided only by the smell of fresh bread or roasted maize, the women snatched their food away before her hands could touch it. "Don't let her near it," they would mutter. "Her curse will poison it." Some even hissed at her to leave, calling her a bad omen. The sound of their voices burned more than any slap ever could. The men were no kinder. They didn't just ignore her, they spat on the ground when she passed, as if to cleanse the earth from her presence. Sometimes, they muttered insults under their breath, loud enough for her to hear. "Blind witch," one man sneered once, his voice full of disgust. The gods must have shut her eyes for a reason. Nyahira flinched, but she didn't stop walking. She never did. Her life was a cycle of humiliation, day after day. She woke up to emptiness and went to sleep with nothing but the sound of her own breathing to keep her company. No one cared if she ate. No one cared if she lived. Yet, somehow, Nyahira never let the hatred break her completely. Her body was frail, her clothes torn and dirty, but her spirit that stayed untouched. Every night, after the village fires died down and the laughter faded into the quiet hum of the night, Nyahira would sit outside her little hut under the fig tree. The wind would brush against her skin, gentle and familiar, like an old friend. She would tilt her head to the sky, imagining the stars she could no longer see, and whisper softly to the night. "One day," she murmured, her voice steady despite the ache in her heart, "one day, they'll see who I truly am." She didn't know if the stars were listening. She didn't know if anyone was. But the words gave her strength, even when her stomach twisted with hunger, and her heart begged her to give up. Something deep inside her refused to let go of hope. A small, flickering flame that no amount of cruelty could extinguish. Nyahira didn't know what her future held, but she knew one thing: she wasn't a curse. And no matter how hard they tried to convince her otherwise, she wasn't going to believe them. The sun hung high over Ekunde, scorching the land below. The air was thick and dry, the kind of heat that made the villagers retreat to the shade of their huts. The only sounds were the occasional bleat of a goat and the rustle of wind through the baobab trees. That was when he appeared. A stranger, his steps slow and steady as he walked into the village. His name was Kwame. His skin was deep and rich, kissed by the sun from long days on the road. His clothes were worn, but clean, and his eyes were warm, filled with a quiet kindness that seemed out of place in such a cruel village. His smile was easy and inviting, like the first cool breeze after a long, dry season. The villagers noticed him, of course. Strangers didn't pass through Ekunde often. They watched him from the corners of their eyes, curious but cautious. He didn't seem to mind their stares. He walked calmly, taking in the village with an air of quiet understanding. Then he saw her. Nyahira was sitting by the well, her hands running over the rough stones to guide her. Her head was held high, even though the villagers around her laughed and whispered, as they always did. Kwame's eyes lingered on her. He didn't see a cursed girl or a broken soul. He saw strength, the way she carried herself, the quiet dignity in her posture, even as they mocked her. It stirred something deep within him. Where others saw weakness, he saw resilience. The more he watched her, the more he felt drawn to her. He couldn't explain why. It wasn't pity. It wasn't sadness. It was admiration, something he wasn't sure he'd ever felt so strongly before. While the others continued to sneer and whisper, Kwame did something no one else had ever done. He walked straight to her. The laughter quieted, but Nyahira didn't notice. She was used to the silence by now. "Why do they treat you this way?" he asked softly, his voice low and steady, as though he was afraid to startle her. Nyahira froze. No one had ever asked her that, not once. For a moment, she thought she might be imagining it, that the heat had finally gotten to her head, but his voice was real, and it was gentle in a way that made her heart ache. She turned her face toward the sound, unsure if she should answer. What was the point? Would he even believe her? Still, something about him felt different. "Because I'm blind," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "They think I'm cursed." Kwame didn't flinch. He didn't gasp or step back like the others did when they heard those words. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his voice steady and sure. "Curses only hold power if you believe in them," he said. His words weren't meant to comfort her. They weren't empty or hollow like the false kindnesses she had heard before. He spoke like it was the simplest truth in the world. Nyahira didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever looked at her like that. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, truly seen. And for a moment, the weight of the villagers' hatred didn't feel quite so heavy. Kwame didn't leave like the others before him. He stayed, returning to Nyahira every day, always with something in hand, a sweet mango, warm bread, or simply his voice, filled with stories from distant lands. He told her of mountains that touched the clouds, rivers that roared like lions, and villages where people danced in the streets until dawn. Nyahira listened, holding on to every word, painting the images in her mind, even though her eyes could no longer see. But it wasn't the gifts or the stories that made her heart feel lighter. It was how he spoke to her, like she wasn't broken. He didn't treat her like a blind girl or an outcast. He spoke to her like she mattered, like she was worth knowing. He asked about her life, her dreams, and her hopes, things no one else had ever cared to ask. For the first time in years, Nyahira laughed. It wasn't a quiet, careful laugh, but a real, joyful sound that filled the air. Kwame laughed too, a deep, warm sound that made her chest flutter. For the first time, she didn't feel invisible. She felt alive. The villagers noticed. At first, they watched from afar, whispering among themselves. They thought Kwame pitied her, but when they saw him return again and again, their curiosity turned to suspicion. They didn't understand why he stayed. "She's cursed," they muttered. "Why does he waste his time?" The whispers didn't stop Kwame. Each day, he returned to Nyahira, and their bond only grew stronger. She began to feel something she hadn't dared to feel in years: hope. Then, one evening, as the sun bled across the sky, Kwame did something no one expected. The village gathered around the central fire, and his voice rang out, clear and unwavering. "I wish to marry Nyahira," he declared. The village froze. For a moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Then came the gasps, rippling through the crowd like a wave. "Marry the blind girl?" a voice scoffed. Bwana, the village chief, stepped forward. He was a tall man with a heavy scowl, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Have you lost your mind, traveller?" Bwana was not a man who was questioned. His word was law. The villagers waited, expecting Kwame to realize his mistake and back down. Kwame didn't move. He met Bwana's glare without flinching. His voice didn't shake. "I see more in her than any of you ever will." The words hung in the air like thunder. The village fell silent again, but this time it wasn't from shock. It was something deeper, something they couldn't quite name. Nyahira's heart pounded. No one had ever spoken for her, defended her, or believed in her. She felt a warmth deep inside, something she hadn't felt in so long: pride. The villagers had spent years seeing only her blindness, her so-called curse. But here was a man, a stranger, who saw her strength, her spirit, who saw her. For the first time, Nyahira wasn't ashamed of who she was. Someone loved her, not despite her blindness, but because they saw everything else she was. And for the first time, the villagers had nothing to say. The wedding day arrived quietly, without celebration. There were no drums, no dancing, no songs of blessing that usually filled the air when a wedding took place in Ekunde. The villagers didn't gather to rejoice. Instead, they watched from a distance, their whispers floating through the wind like dry leaves. Some laughed cruelly, shaking their heads at the sight. A blind girl, a cursed girl, becoming a wife. It was unthinkable to them. Nyahira stood tall, though her heart pounded in her chest. She wore a simple dress, one her brother Jabari had helped sew together from pieces of cloth he found. It wasn't fine silk or brightly dyed fabric like the other brides wore. It was plain, but it was clean and soft, and it made her feel beautiful for the first time in her life. Jabari stood beside her, his small hand holding hers tightly. He was the only one who came. The rest of her family refused. Her mother said it was better to pretend she didn't have a daughter at all than to watch her marry a man who would surely regret it. Her father didn't speak a word. He simply turned his back on her when she left the hut that morning. But Nyahira didn't cry. She had cried too many times already. Today her heart wasn't filled with sadness. It was filled with something else, a quiet, fragile kind of hope. Kwame waited for her beneath the old baobab tree on the edge of the village, where the sun cast long shadow over the dry earth. He wore a simple tunic, his hair freshly cut, his eyes warm and steady as he watched her approach. To him, she looked like the most beautiful woman in the world. When she reached him, he took her hands gently in his own. His touch was warm, comforting, and familiar. The village's spiritual elder wasn't there to bless the union. No one was. But Kwame didn't need their... The night the storm came, Ekunde trembled beneath the sky. Thunder crashed like drums of war, shaking the ground. Lightning clawed through the darkness, lighting up the village in jagged bursts. The wind howled like an angry spirit, ripping leaves from the baobab trees and sending them swirling through the air. The river, Mwenje, roared louder than ever before, its voice rising with the storm. Nyahira woke with a start, her heart racing in her chest. The air felt heavy, wrong. The sound of the rain pounding against the roof was deafening, but underneath it she heard something else, something deeper, more powerful. It wasn't the storm, it was the earth itself, groaning, twisting, crying out in pain. Her body trembled as she sat up, her hands gripping the thin blanket tightly. She didn't understand how she knew, but the truth crashed over her like a wave. "The river," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It's going to flood the village by dawn." Kwame stirred beside her, his brows furrowing in concern. He didn't ask how she knew. He didn't question her. He looked into her face, her expression filled with fear and certainty, and he believed her without hesitation. He jumped to his feet, pulling on his cloak. "I'll warn the village," he said firmly. He kissed her forehead, his voice low and steady. "They'll listen. They have to." Nyahira felt her throat tighten with worry, but she nodded. She trusted him. Kwame ran into the storm, his voice booming through the howling wind as he pounded on doors. "Wake up! The river is rising. We have to leave." The villagers stirred, groggy and irritated, peering out of their huts. Rain soaked Kwame to the bone, but he didn't stop. He reached Chief Bwana's hut, hammering on the wooden door. The chief emerged, scowling, his expression dark with annoyance. "What is this nonsense?" Bwana snapped. "It's a storm. We've survived worse." Kwame's chest heaved with breath. Nyahira heard it. "She says the river will flood the village by dawn." Bwana's face twisted into a sneer. He laughed, loud and cruel. "She's blind. What can she possibly know?" His voice dripped with mockery. "A cursed girl telling the future. You've lost your senses." The crowd gathered, muttering among themselves. They stared at Kwame like he was a fool, shaking their heads. Some laughed along with Bwana, others just turned away. But then, a deep, low rumble shook the ground beneath their feet. It wasn't thunder, it was the earth groaning, just as Nyahira had heard. The villagers froze, their eyes wide with fear. A moment later, Mwenye roared like a beast, louder than anyone had ever heard. The river broke free from its banks, a wall of water surging forward, devouring the fields and tearing through the village edge. Huts collapsed, livestock were swept away, and screams filled the air as people ran for their lives. The water came faster than they could imagine, crashing through Ekunde with unstoppable force. Everything Bwana had laughed at, everything Nyahira had warned them about, was happening right before their eyes. The villagers fled to higher ground, panting and soaked, watching helplessly as the water swallowed their homes. Those who had laughed at Nyahira moments ago now stared at each other in stunned silence. "She knew," someone whispered, voice trembling. "She knew before it happened." Bwana stood among them, his face pale and his arrogance gone. He didn't speak, he couldn't, and as the storm raged on, Nyahira sat in her small hut, the wind howling outside, her heart heavy with both fear and something else, something new. For the first time, she wasn't sure if her blindness was a curse at all. Maybe, just maybe, it was something more. The sun rose slowly over the soaked village of Ekunde, casting golden light on the muddy remains of what was once a bustling home to many. The storm had passed, but the damage was done. Huts were swept away, livestock lost, and fields drowned. Yet, despite the destruction, not a single life was taken. All because of Nyahira's warning. Word spread like wildfire. The blind outcast, the girl once mocked and avoided, had saved them all. People whispered about how she had heard the river's anger before it came. Some said she spoke to the earth itself. Others believed the gods had given her a gift, a second sight hidden within her blindness. Those who once spat at her feet now sought her out. Women who refused to let her near their food now brought her offerings of sweet fruits and fresh bread. Children who once laughed at her stumbling now held her hand, guiding her through the village. The same men who once turned their backs on her now bowed their heads in quiet respect. Nyahira's life had transformed overnight. It didn't stop with the flood. Strange, wondrous things began to happen. One day, a boy named Omari wandered too far into the hills and didn't come back. His mother, frantic with worry, came to Nyahira, begging for help. Nyahira listened to the wind, tilting her head as though the breeze carried a message only she could hear. "Go to the old acacia tree by the western cliff," she said softly. "He's there. He's scared, but he's safe." The villagers rushed to the spot and found Omari exactly where Nyahira had said, huddled beneath a twisted tree, cold and hungry, but alive. Then the crops flourished. The fields, still soaked from the flood, were expected to wither and rot, but they didn't. Instead, the plants grew faster and healthier than anyone had ever seen. Green maize stalks stood tall, beans sprouted strong, and sweet yams flourished in the rich soil. The village had never seen such abundance. When a sickness swept through a nearby village, Ekunde feared it would spread to them. People came to Nyahira, eyes wide with fear. She listened again, her head tilting to the wind, the ground, the river. "Boil the bitter root and drink it," she told them. "The sickness won't touch you." They listened, and the sickness passed by their village, leaving Ekunde untouched. The people no longer saw Nyahira as the blind, cursed girl. They saw her for what she truly was, a protector, a gift. They began to call her Mama Mwenje, Mother of the River. It was a name spoken with reverence, with love. People came not to mock her, but to seek her wisdom. Even Chief Bwana, his pride battered and broken, bowed his head when he spoke to her now. Nyahira, who had once eaten scraps alone on the outskirts, now sat beneath the great baobab tree in the center of the village, her head held high. The people gathered around her, listening to her voice with the same respect they once gave only to their elders. She no longer hid in the shadows. She belonged, and though she still couldn't see the village around her, she could feel it, stronger, kinder, and more alive than it had ever been. Nyahira wasn't just the blind girl anymore. She was their light, their guide, their hero. The day came when Chief Bwana, the man who once mocked Nyahira louder than anyone, stood before her with his head bowed. The village gathered in hushed silence, the air thick with something heavier than the heat, guilt. The same people who once turned their backs on her, who laughed, spat, and called her cursed, now looked at her with shame-filled eyes. Chief Bwana, a man known for his arrogance and pride, lowered himself to his knees in front of Nyahira. His voice, usually booming and commanding, was quiet, almost broken. "We were wrong," he said, his voice trembling. "All of us. Forgive us. We were the blind ones, not you." The crowd held their breath. Nyahira sat beneath the old baobab tree, the same place where Kwame once vowed his love to her. She didn't move. Her hands rested gently in her lap, her face calm, but her heart twisted inside her chest. For years, these people had made her life unbearable. They stole her childhood with their cruel words and cold stares. They made her believe she was worthless, cursed, better off alone, and now they wanted forgiveness. Her throat tightened, but her voice came out steady, soft, but strong enough for everyone to hear. "I don't need your apologies," she said slowly, each word holding weight. "I needed your kindness when I was alone. I needed your love when I was hurting." The village fell into an aching, uncomfortable silence. No one could look her in the eye, not even Chief Bwana. Mothers remembered the times they pulled their children away from her. Fathers remembered how they spat at the ground when she passed. The children, now old enough to understand, felt their cheeks burn with shame, remembering how they laughed and mimicked her stumbling steps. Bwana's head hung lower, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We can't undo what we did, but we see you now, Nyahira. Truly see you." Nyahira's heart ached, not with anger, that had burned out long ago. It ached with sorrow for the girl she used to be, the girl who cried herself to sleep, wondering why no one loved her, the girl who clung to hope, even when the world told her not to. She took a slow breath, her fingers trembling just slightly in her lap. "I never wanted you to see me as a hero," she said softly. "I only ever wanted to belong." The silence stretched, heavy and painful. Then slowly, one by one, the villagers knelt. First, a young woman Nyahira recognized as the one who once threw dirty water at her feet. Then an elderly man who used to whisper that she was cursed. Even the children, their eyes wide with regret, knelt too. Chief Bwana stayed on his knees, his voice thick with emotion. "You belong, Nyahira. You always did. We were too blind to see it." Tears pricked Nyahira's eyes. She didn't want to cry. Not now. Not in front of the people who had once made her feel so small. But the weight of their words, the raw honesty in their voices, broke something open inside her. She wasn't sure if she could ever forget the pain they caused her. But as she looked toward where she knew Kwame stood, his warm, steady presence like a light in the dark, she realized something. She didn't need to carry that pain anymore. For the first time, she wasn't holding on to the past. She was free. The wind rustled through the baobab leaves, and Nyahira smiled, not for them, but for herself. That night, the sky stretched endlessly above Ekunde, painted with thousands of shimmering stars. The air was cool and quiet, the kind of silence that feels peaceful rather than empty. Nyahira sat beside Kwame, her hand resting gently in his. The wind played softly with her hair, and for once, the world felt still. Kwame squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing against her skin. His voice, usually so steady and warm, carried a different weight tonight, something deeper, something unspoken. Nyahira, he began, his voice low and careful. I have a secret too. Nyahira tilted her head slightly, her brows knitting together. A secret? She couldn't imagine what he might be hiding. He had never once treated her with anything less than honesty and kindness. What is it? She asked softly. Kwame took a breath, his fingers tightening around hers. I'm not just a traveller. I'm Prince Kwame of Mbale, heir to the kingdom. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Nyahira's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of his words. A prince? He wasn't just a kind stranger who had wandered into Ekunde. He was royalty. You're a prince. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. Kwame nodded, though she couldn't see it. His voice held no pride, no arrogance, only truth. Yes, I left the palace to see the world beyond its walls. I wanted to understand the people I would one day rule, to see life not as a prince but as a man. That's when I found you. Nyahira's heart pounded in her chest. A prince. He had walked among her people, eaten their food, shared their pain, and no one had known. He had chosen her, not as a royal obligation, but as a man who saw her worth when no one else did. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, her voice trembling. Kwame's hand moved to her cheek, his touch soft and reassuring. Because I didn't fall in love with you as a prince. I fell in love with you because you are stronger than any queen. Nyahira felt her throat tighten with emotion. She wasn't the broken, cursed girl the village once believed her to be. She wasn't just the blind outcast anymore. She was Nyahira, the woman who had endured, who had risen, who had saved her people when no one believed she could. Kwame leaned closer, his forehead resting gently against hers. You showed me true strength, not the kind that comes from a throne or an army, but the kind that comes from the heart. You are more than I ever dreamed of finding. Tears pricked Nyahira's eyes, but they weren't born from sadness. They were tears of something else, relief, joy, love. You could have had anyone, she whispered, her voice barely holding together. Kwame smiled softly. I didn't want anyone else. I wanted you. And together they stood, not as an outcast and a traveller, but as something more. A woman who saw the truth without her eyes, and a man who saw her worth beyond her blindness. They returned to Mbale, where Nyahira wasn't just accepted. She was celebrated. The people adored her, not for her beauty or her sight, but for her wisdom and unbreakable spirit. She ruled beside Kwame, not with sight, but with vision, a vision that stretched far beyond what eyes could see. Ekunde never forgot her, and the villagers who once mocked her spoke her name with pride, teaching their children the story of Nyahira, the blind girl who became a queen,